things before we get started tonight. I want to make sure that everybody's got their mute button on. If you've got a question, if you're new to us, make sure that you use the chat feature at the bottom. We'll ask questions at the end. As you know, all our talks are brought to you by Cape Cod 5, First Citizens Federal Credit Union, and Martha's Vineyard Savings. All copies of the books are available at 8 Cousins Bookseller in Falmouth. So we want to make sure you patronize the local establishment. A quick reminder for our members out there. First of all, if you're not a member, we really hope that you become one. For our members out there, our annual meeting of members is this coming Saturday at 10 a.m. Yes, there's another Zoom opportunity, so want to make sure you're there for that. So make sure you sign up for that. And our speaker tonight is coming to us from Washington, D.C. And although he is familiar with Massachusetts, he went to high school in Cambridge. He worked at Harvard. Jamie Holmes is living in Washington, D.C. This is his second book. His first one was, I find it fascinating, called Nonsense, The Power of Not Knowing. And this one, it talks about World War II. And so without further ado, would you welcome our guest tonight, Jamie Holmes.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'm going to now try to share my screen here and see if we can get some slides up. I added some photos that might be of interest. Okay, is that working? That's not really what I wanted to do. I wanted to do that. No, that's presenter view. View slideshow. How about that? There we go. Okay. So thanks again. I'll dive right in. World War II was the first war in history which was decided by weapons which did not exist at the onset of the conflict. Everyone knows the story of the atomic bomb, but the book is really about the second most important secret weapon on the Allied side, which is the proximity fuse, the smart fuse, which I will get to in a second. But more broadly, the book is about the unique collision of science and warfare that occurred during the war, and the strange new obstacles that presented. As the engineer, the Yankee Vannevar Bush said in 1941, it is being realized with a thud that the world is now probably going to be ruled by those who know how, in the fullest sense, to apply science, whatever their other attributes may be. And one of the things that I thought I would start with, and I was struck during my research, was how much resistance scientists faced in the early days before Pearl Harbor. So I thought I would begin with how Bush recruited scientists to the war effort, and then get to the story of this smart weapon, which much of the book is about. So in 1939, the US Army was smaller than Portugal's. We had only the 17th largest army in the world. And not only was our military undersized, but our equipment and our weapons had grown obsolete. In 1938, the Army devoted only 1.5% of its budget to research. The Navy apparently treated radar as a hobby project. And there was very little basic science, basic fundamental new research, which could result in breakthrough discoveries. So the difference between taking your existing armor and trying to improve it versus doing experiments on new materials and inventing entirely new armor. There's very little of that basic research which could really result in fundamental breakthroughs and new weapons and new medicines. And there's scientists who were aware of this problem. And one of them was Vannevar Bush. He was an engineer, he was an inventor. He was in 1938 the vice president of MIT. He was a founder of Raytheon. He developed one of the first analog computers. And he was also a brilliant administrator. These are two pictures of Bush. The top left is in his basement machine shop, where he's obviously posing for a photograph, but he's tinkering with tinkering and inventing and always having strange new ideas for inventions. And that was sort of one side of his personality. And then the other side was this administrative side, which you see on the bottom right, where he's leaning back in his chair. And this is after the formation of this new scientific research initiative. He's got his white shoes and white socks, and the guy behind him looks very intimidated, and he sort of looks intimidating. He was, before the war, the president of the Carnegie Institution of Washington, which was a Carnegie-funded research institution. It had an endowment in today's dollars of $7 billion. He was among the most famous scientists. He would say he's an engineer in the country, and certainly one of the best connected. Time magazine described Bush as emperor of the biggest scientific empire under one management in the world. Sharing is paused. Is there a reason my sharing is paused? Bring my shared, are you not seeing my slides?
Yeah, Jamie, it's still on slide 1. You're in presenter view, so we see things to the slide, but yeah, it's still on the first slide.
I see, that's not what I intend. So I want to bring my shared view to the front. I definitely want to do that. Resume share. I pressed resume share. That's very strange. Okay, I'm going to stop the share. I'm going to share it again. Are you on slide 2 now?
Yes.
Okay, let's see if this works. So this is Van Bush. I described it quickly, but he's in his machine shop on the left, sort of in his role as an inventor. On the bottom right, he's leaned back in his chair and he's looking intimidating. He was, among his other roles, I said he was the president of the Carnegie Institution of Washington. He was also the vice chairman of NACA, the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, which did aeronautics research for the military. And in this role, in 1939, he testifies before Congress, and he's worried about aviation. In particular, he's worried about Germany's progress in aviation science. So he goes before both houses, the Senate and the House, and he complains and he says, look, they're way ahead of us. We need to invest in a new research institute in California to catch up to Germany. So he says, look, they're building much better planes than us. They have way more personnel than us. They have more facilities at one of their aeronautical stations than we have in all of ours, and they have 5 major stations. And the funds that he asks for are incredibly denied. One of the reasons initially denied. One of the reasons for this is that we already had an aeronautics research institution in Virginia. The senators from Virginia didn't like the idea that the new facility was going to be in California. And so they sort of played politics with him, and they questioned his motives, and they say, are you warmongering? Apparently, one of these discussions became so heated that an argument broke out. Bush thought he was going to be kicked out of the room. According to his records at MIT, he said the argument was so heated it was stricken from the permanent congressional record. And he gets into, even what's on the record is pretty fiery. So a senator asks him, are you really saying that Germany could bomb us? Do you really think they could load up their airplanes with bombs and fly, across the ocean or 1,000 miles? And Bush says, not today, Senator, but maybe tomorrow. And things that were not feasible when I was a boy are feasible today. That's how science works. And the senator says something like, we are not talking about your boyhood. And he tells Bush, that will not happen 1,000 years from now. What you're saying, this threat that you're talking about, it's not existent. So Bush realizes that the US Congress is asleep on the technical end. And unlike many others, he's in a position to do something about it. He doesn't trust Congress, nor does he particularly trust the military. He wrote a letter to former President Herbert Hoover in 1939, and he complains, when military men are queried, they usually reply that the answer to a plane is another plane. He's thinking of radar in particular. So Bush knows, and Bush's colleagues know, that there have been scientific advancements in the 1930s, particularly in radar, which would allow for rapid new advances, and the Army and the Navy research laboratories are not equipped to do it. We need a new organization. So what does he do about it? He asks President Herbert Hoover, and 2 days before the Nazis occupy Paris, on June 12th, 1940, Bush takes a single-page plan to the Oval Office. He meets Roosevelt for the first time. Roosevelt writes, "Okay, FDR," on the single sheet. He'd already made up his mind, and the brief discussion was over. The meeting lasted only 10 minutes. Out of this came the National Defense Research Committee. This would be the organization that would oversee the atomic bomb, that would oversee the developments in radar at MIT, that would oversee the proximity fuse and 200 other devices and medicines like penicillin. So and it was set up in a very interesting way. They used a World War I era statute that only required the approval of Roosevelt's cabinet. And it had some unique features. Initially, it reported, well, actually throughout the war, Bush reported directly to FDR, not through the usual military channels. So that was unusual. Also, at the beginning, it drew its funds directly from the executive, from Roosevelt's emergency fund. So really early on, it was immune from congressional oversight. After Pearl Harbor, getting money from Congress was not a problem. But early on, he didn't even have to. Skeptics saw the formation of this organization. It was later called, first it was called the National Defense Research Council, then it was called the Office of Scientific Research and Development. They saw it as an end run, a grab by which a small group of scientists and engineers acting outside of established channels took control of the authority and the money to make new weapons. And Bush said, yep, that's exactly what it was. This skepticism of the military and Congress turned out to be well-founded. Before Pearl Harbor, the legislature even reduced the White House's emergency budget, and Bush had to go to a private citizen, John D. Rockefeller, to get a stopgap loan so that OSRD scientists could continue their vital work uninterrupted, including their work on the Manhattan Project. That was in May of 1941, because they were running out of money. And then also Bush would use his leverage with Roosevelt and his direct contacts with Roosevelt, the fact that he reported to him directly, to win several important political battles that he had with military commanders who didn't want to use the new weapons or weren't really open to using new weapons in new strategic ways. So this turned out to be a very brilliant way to set up this organization. One of the scientists, and the main topic of 12 Seconds of Silence, is this group called Section T. It was a group organized under Bush, led by a man Bush knew very well. He already worked for a Carnegie institution, the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, and his name was Merle Tuve. He was a physicist at DTM, as I said, Department of Terrestrial Magnetism. It's now called the Earth and Planets Laboratory. On the left, he's sort of tinkering with something in 1936. This is his family on the right in 1945. The picture on the right was given to me by his daughter, and if I'm not mistaken, I saw her name pop up, so I think she's watching. So hi Lucy. So Merle Tuve in 1940 begins this work. He doesn't know what he's going to do. He knows he's going to make some ordnance of some kind, whatever the Army asks him to do. And what he is asked, well, first let me go back. To give you some context as to the experience that he brought to the project. None of and they were mostly physicists at the beginning, had any experience making weapons. But they did have experience making things. The physicists of that era had to make everything for their experiments. So there's a good quote. It said, physicists of the era, a scientist explained, had to pit their brains against bits of iron, metals, and crystals to force their fickle contraptions to work. An experimental physicist, another said, was a jack of all trades, a versatile but amateur craftsman. He must blow glass and turn metal, carpenter, photograph, wire electric circuits, and be a master of gadgets of all kinds. So Tuve had background in, why is there drawing on here? That's very strange. Tuve had a background in radio, wireless radio, and he did his PhD on wireless radio, but no background making weapons. This is, again, I apologize for this. I don't know why that's happening. It's a drawing on my slides. So this was the problem that he was asked to solve. The Navy came to him, and the Navy said, we need help shooting down airplanes. We don't know how to do it. We're really, really bad at it. This was a problem for the British as well. And this was the problem. This was a time fuse. This was an explosive device that you put on the end of an anti-aircraft shell. You twist it into the shell as you would the top of a, let's say, a big flashlight or the top of a thermos. And it would set off an explosive, it would set off a little primer, and the shell would explode. These were explosive shells. So if you were trying to shoot down an airplane at the beginning of the war, what you did is you would have to turn the timer. You see there's a timing mechanism on the clock fuse there. And you would set it for 10 seconds. And you would look through your telescopic lens, and you would say, there's the height of the plane, there's the range, there's the heading. You would predict where it's going to be in 10 seconds. And you would have to try to shoot and predict the path of it and get the timing on this clock fuse exactly right so that it would blow up near the airplane. Now that was very, very difficult. The shells moved 2,000 feet a second. They rotated over 250 times a second. And it turned out that you had to get the timing right to the window of 1/40th of a second. So you can imagine there's dead time when you're loading the shell. Very, very difficult to do. So at the beginning of the war, and at the start of the Blitz in September of 1940, it took 20,000 shots from an anti-aircraft round to shoot down one single airplane. This is called the rounds per bird. 20,000 to 1. I've seen even higher figures, 100,000 to 1 at the start of the Blitz. So very, very difficult, especially at night. Now, there were other problems. They needed better radar. They needed better aiming devices. But this was one of the major challenges. In fact, the anti-aircraft guns were so bad in London that they stopped firing them. And it was only after the citizens became upset and became angry that there were at least no sounds that we were fighting back that they began shooting again. In other words, it was just a morale booster to hear the guns firing. They knew they weren't going to hit much. The physicist James Van Allen, who worked with Merle Tuve, said at the start of the war, it would be just a sheer stroke of luck to hit anything. The solution to this was simple in theory, but very difficult in practice. What if you could have some kind of electronic sensor instead of this clock fuse mechanism that you had to twist that just sensed the airplane automatically? And it would sense the airplane within a certain distance, in theory, and explode. Now, you can imagine a number of different ways of sensing an airplane. And they tried all of them. They tested all of them at the beginning of the war. You could try to use the plane's shadow or its glare and design a photoelectric fuse that went off with a change in light. You could try to have an infrared sensor to hone in on the engine's heat signature. You might build a listening device to explode near the sound of the airplane propeller. Or you could make a fuse with a little radar ear that would bounce a radar signal off the plane and come back, and that would be the signal. That's what they ended up doing. Or you could even design a sensor to trigger near an airplane's low intensity magnetic field. The real problem was, in order to make any of these sensors, they had to use very delicate electronics. And the electronics of the day were just not built to withstand the pressures in an anti-aircraft gun. There's one particular part that was very sensitive called a vacuum tube. If you can see this, this is a size of a pen. And this little tube worked. Today, it would be a silicon transistor, which would conduct the flow of electricity that hadn't been invented yet. So you needed a sensor, you needed 2 of these to amplify the sensor, and you needed a trigger tube. And this has very, very fine filaments inside. It's sort of like a light bulb. To couple the fact that the batteries were going to be very sensitive. So you have these very delicate electronics, and then you have tremendous pressures inside of an anti-aircraft gun. Inside an anti-aircraft gun, the pressure is 20,000 times the force of gravity. So to put that in perspective, a space shuttle during launch is 3 times the force of gravity. Bombs are just dropped, that's gravity. Rockets at the time were 100 times the force of gravity. So the puzzle that Merle Tuve and what became known as Section T, T for Tuve, the puzzle that they faced were trying to shrink these electronics into the size of that same clock fuse that you saw before, something similar, and make the electronics strong enough, rugged enough to withstand this firing off shock. That was the challenge. Just like Bush, they were very alone at the start of the war. This is a wonderful picture at where Tuve worked at the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism. And this is the first gun that Section T was able to obtain from the military to test electronic parts. It's an old howitzer from 1916, some spare gun that they had. And in back of it is the cyclotron. That is a particle accelerator. So that's what they were working on at the time. And then this is sort of the new challenge right there. Before they got this gun, they couldn't get any gun from the military. So at the beginning, you know, in August of 1940, they only had a budget of $25,000, which gives you an indication of the amount of priority that was being placed on this project and the chances of success. Even Van Bush didn't think that Tuve was going to be able to do this. The British certainly didn't think they could Tuve could do it. They thought it was impossible. The Germans weren't able to do it. So everyone thought this was going to be a very, very difficult challenge. And certainly early in the war, that was reflected by the level of investment. But before they got this gun, they couldn't get any gun. They had to build their own gun. So they used steel tubing. They had to build their own shells to fire their own shells. They couldn't get access to a firing range. So Tuve asked one of his friends, an economist by the name of Gardner Means, hey, can I use your farm out in Virginia? We want to shoot off some experimental bullets, and I can't tell you what they are. I said, okay, you can use my farm. So they brought out their makeshift gun. This is the early days in the fall of 1940, and they would shoot these amateur shells up in the air with electronic components in them to see if they could withstand the pressure and what might be done to modify them to withstand the pressure. And they would hold wooden boards over their heads. And Tuve has this wonderful quote, let's shoot them straight up and they'll come down again. And the chances of them hitting us are very small. We'll find out what happens. Inside the test round, right. So not only did they have to build their own gun and their own shells and fire their own field, at the beginning, they didn't even know what gunpowder to use. So they literally looked up dynamite in the yellow pages, went over to Georgetown, bought some gunpowder. They initially bought the wrong gunpowder. And in one case, they almost sort of blew themselves up by using the wrong gunpowder. This was in the early days. It just gives you a sense of how sort of wild and haphazard the early days of Section T were. I found documentation that even in October of 1940, they maybe had 5 or 6 people working for them for Section T. It was a very small group at first, and of course it quickly expanded. By the end of the war, it was over 1,000 people. But I found documentation where Tuve is asking for more help in October of 1940. I need more help. I need more workers. And can we have them full-time? He's writing his administrator at the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, who says, okay, for a week you can have them for full-time, but then back to part-time. This was sort of what they were facing. They were working in this new building. This is the cyclotron building that we just saw a picture of the basement of. And it was brand new. In fact, it was unfinished. They moved in the fall of 1940, and they had no place to hang their coats. There weren't enough chairs. There weren't enough stools. The ceiling sprinklers, which were the emergency nozzles for chemical fires, leaked. There weren't enough trash cans. These glass panels, which you see on the outside there, were also used as office dividers, but they touched the walls completely, which was inconvenient because they had to have confidential, secret conversations, and one group working on one aspect of the project couldn't hear what the other groups were talking about, so they had to plug the holes in the walls. The most remarkable, sort of macabre document or example of this sort of early state of things is Merle writes his administrator, and he says, I need an adequate supply of pencils, pads, and other stationery. And your assistant has requested a formal memorandum from me to you before he can do this. So he doesn't have paper. As Vannevar Bush and the National Defense Research Council are just getting underway, and as Section T is making their anti-aircraft gun and their shells out of steel pipe, what is Germany doing? They're expanding the most advanced weapons research and development center in the world. It's called Peenemünde. And this is an aerial wartime shot of Peenemünde. This is on Usedom, an island in northeast Germany on the Baltic. It had at its height elegant modern housing for 3,000 scientists, engineers, and their families, bakeries, cafes, a grocery shop, a bookstore, a beauty salon, a butcher, and 4 movie theaters. They had a school, a sports field, tennis courts. On Wednesday mornings, they swam and played handball and soccer. They picked blueberries. By 1940, Peenemünde had 1,700 scientists, technicians, and engineers and other employees important enough to merit civilian draft exemptions. State-of-the-art laboratories, assembly halls, huge production facilities. On the East Coast, if you see on the right where it says A, that would be on the right-hand side on the top. That's where they developed the V2. It was a rocket that was fired at London after the V1. The V1, Vergeltungswaffe 1, would be fired had a test ramp on G at the top of the island. That was a Luftwaffe project. That's a pilotless aircraft, which I'm going to talk about a bit. The rockets, the V2, was an army project, a German army project. So this is the V1. This would become the greatest challenge that the fuse would face. It accomplished the fuse, the smart fuse, the proximity fuse, would accomplish great things in the Pacific and great things at the Battle of the Bulge. But I think this is probably the most dramatic instance of its adversary, its nemesis, the V1. This was called Revenge Weapon 1 by the Nazi propagandist Joseph Goebbels. You can see there's a soldier there. You get some sense of the scale. This was a 5,000-pound pilotless aircraft. It had an 1,800-pound warhead and a 20-foot wingspan, 19-foot wingspan, a maximum speed of 408 miles an hour. And these were launched at London in the summer of 1944 off of these 150-foot launching ramps using a chemical propulsion system. You can see the launching ramp better here. And this would become the greatest test of the fuse in 1944. So this is what the Germans are doing as Tuve is asking for stationery and not getting it. And I'll read you just a few small things that I found from memos that Tuve wrote his boss before Pearl Harbor. So this is November 1941. This is a memo that Tuve wrote to his boss, Richard Tolman, who was under Bush. For the last 16 months, I have felt nothing but a heavy load at the top. Again, like a cork bumping the top of a filled tank. This time, I am not willing to attempt a compromise solution for the next few weeks, as before. I believe that the trouble is a total lack of policy for the whole division, and perhaps for the whole NDRC. I am willing to discuss the broad question, but I am also willing to let our own section collide with whatever catastrophe may be in store for it. This is not my war. Now, he's using this phrase, "this is not my war," as a facetiously, flippantly, as accusatorily. This is what you think. You're not giving me enough resources because you don't want to take full responsibility for this war. This was the kind of character he was, sort of a brilliant guy with sharp elbows. He liked to fight, and he was very pushy, which was great, great for Section T. But that gives you a sense of his character. Even in December 1941, it's another short section here. This is December 6th, 1941. 16 months have already passed since Section T was formed. A policy now should be adopted which is based not simply on an arbitrary square footage of space. They were running out of space at the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism because they kept hiring more people, kept expanding, but on a real knowledge and a rational view of the needs of the national emergency and the extent to which the section might be effective in meeting these needs during the next several years. And then in large capital letters, he says at the end of this memo, the time is shorter than we think, ... And he submits that to his boss the day before Pearl Harbor. After Pearl Harbor, the situation changes very quickly. The Navy, there was also the sinking of these two British warships, the Repulse and the other, which the name anyway, there was two of them. And these were the greatest British warships, and they were down by 3 Japanese planes within minutes because they didn't have air cover. So this made the Allied navies realize, uh-oh, we really need the fuse right now. We need something to shoot down airplanes right now. And they poured a ton of money into Section T. It immediately expands. In early 1942, TUV moves out of the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, and they start a new laboratory in Silver Spring, Maryland, called the Applied Physics Laboratory. It's still around today. It's called the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. It's in Maryland. It's got 6,000 employees. They still do very similar work. I spoke to them a couple of weeks ago, actually. So this was formed in by March 10th, 1942. I have pictures later of what that looked like, but it was formed in an old garage, and then they had to expand it and so forth. They couldn't tell Hopkins what they were doing. President Roosevelt had to call the president of Hopkins and say, it's okay, you just fund the project, take the contract. So they expanded, and they got to work, and I'll talk about what they did to solve the puzzle of the fuse. Very quickly, I want to take an aside because this is historically interesting and something that many history books get wrong. Oftentimes, the story of the smart fuse is told in the following way, especially by British historians. The British invented the smart fuse and delivered it to Section T to produce because the British didn't have the production facilities to produce the fuse. This has a shred of factual truth, but it's very misleading for reasons I can explain. Yes, the British did deliver the basic design in 1940. By basic design, what do we mean? We mean the wiring. And what was the wiring? The wiring was a sensor, 2 amplifying tubes, and the trigger tube. That was the wiring. So that was delivered. The problem is that most historians miss the distinction between the shell fuse, and there were other fuses for bombs and for rockets. But the fuses for bombs and rockets didn't have this engineering problem which I described. This problem of the 20,000 times the force of gravity. And the shell fuses for anti-aircraft, that was the one that was important. It had a military value 9 times more important than the bomb and the rocket fuses because you couldn't shoot down airplanes with those. The rockets were bad throughout the war. You couldn't name them very well. So yes, they did deliver the circuits, but we didn't really need the circuits. TUV said, later on, he said, yes, we heard the rumors of the circuitry. They gave us the circuits, but I had already articulated the thing into the rockets, the bombs, and the shell. There was a lawsuit which sort of muddles the story. I don't think I need to go into it here. You can ask me about it. You can email me about it. It's in the end notes. But anyway, there's a lawsuit which sort of muddled the story. But basically, this wasn't the kind of invention that it's like turning on a light switch. That's not what the fuse was. The fuse was a grueling statistical challenge. One way to think about it is, let's say there's 500 pieces, 500 parts to a shell fuse. And I believe I have a picture. Later on, I have a picture. Let's say I have 500 parts inside of a fuse. 300 of those parts are so important that if any one of those 300 fails, the fuse will fail. Even if every single one of those 300 parts works 99% of the time, you still have an overall fuse which functions only 5% of the time. So you can see that what the challenge was getting all of these delicate parts up to a high enough percentage that you could get a fuse that worked most of the time. The Navy needed it to work 50% of the time to approve it into combat, into battle. So they developed these vacuum tubes and they worked on it. And within 1 year, they had vacuum tubes that worked 90% of the time. But because of the statistical problem that it was, 90% wasn't good enough. So in that kind of a context, it really doesn't make sense to say that you've delivered an invention. That's really not what the fuse was. So how did they do it? Well, they did it the exact same way that they began. This is a wonderful shot of vertical firing outside of DC during the war, where they've tilted an anti-aircraft gun completely vertically, and they're shooting test shells up in the air. And what they would do is the shells would come down and they would dig them up. That's Merle Tuve, second to right. And this is one of the test fields. And you can see these mounds of dirt here where they've dug up the test shells, and they would take them back and they would analyze them. They would do what they called postmortems on the shells. And a lot of trial and error. So they hired a material science specialist named Ray Minland at Columbia University. And he looked at all the miniature parts inside the fuse, and he figured out their breaking points and which ones were the weakest. They put in tiny little mica support spacers inside the tubes to gird the electronics. They put in these miniature springs called mousetrap springs to hook onto the little filaments inside the tubes, and they would act as like shock absorbers in a car. And they just did a ton and a ton of trial and error. I think on one day they shot 800 test shells. I mean, that was the volume of shells that they were shooting on one of their test sites. And they had 5 or 6 of them. Like the farmers, all complained because their animals were going crazy. So this is what the fuse looks like. This was the fuse that was fired against the V1 in England. On the right is me holding Merle Tuve's souvenir fuse. That was at the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism. And on the left, you can just see how many different parts there was. And this was all kinds of American companies that were involved in making it. You had Hoover, the vacuum company that was making the safety device. You had Energizer that was working on the battery. You had Sperry that was working on the capacitors. You had Raytheon and Sylvania working on the tubes, and so on and so on. 112 companies were involved in making the fuse. This is a nice shot of a vacuum tube. You can see the scale of it, although I already showed you the scale. You can see the mica support spacers on the left. You can see on the right above the paper clip is part of the mousetrap spring that was connected to the filaments. Make sure I've covered everything that I want to cover. So the fuse was introduced by the Navy in early 1943, in January 1943. And over the course of 1943, it was 3 times more effective than the regular shells in the 5-inch Navy guns. So it wasn't mandated, but they shot 25% of their 5-inch shells, common shells. They're about 54 pounds. Only 25% of those that they fired were smart fuses, and yet over 50% of the kills, quote unquote, of enemy planes were shot down by the smart fuse. And then they slowly improved it. They had problems with the batteries. The batteries got better. And then in 1944, after D-Day, it had this confrontation with the V1. So this is a shot of central London in 1944. This is the bomb damage of a single V1 bomb. You can see that it was a devastating weapon. Again, this is Forest Hill, London. This is 100 feet from a V1 explosion. It just rips the roofs off things. This is Sloan Court in central London. This was the site of a great tragedy, which I write about, where 62 Americans of the 130th Chemical Warfare Company died in this V1 attack on July 3rd, 1944. And this is a dramatic shot of a V1 falling over London. If you recall, the pilotless aircraft had a strange looking sort of rifle sight object on top of the aircraft. That was the engine. It's called a pulse jet engine. And it was very, very noisy. The air would come in the front intake. The air and fuel mixture would explode, shut the shutters on the front of the intake, propel, and that process was repeated over 50 times a second. So you had this very noisy opening and closing of these metal shutters. If you look on YouTube, you can hear the sounds of these shutters. It was a very disturbing noise. They were called V1s were called buzz bombs, among other things, because of the noise that they made. And what would happen is you would set the odometer. These were launched from occupied France, from the north of France, off these launching ramps. You would set the odometer, and when the odometer reached its target, the engine would cut, and these drones would fall silently to their marks. And the average time it took between the engine shutting off and the explosion was 12 seconds. And witnesses, this is the title of the book, witnesses, all Londoners really, remember how painful those 12 seconds of silence were, how pregnant they were with fear. Because if you heard the engine stop, you knew you could be hit. If you could hear it, and you could hear it from far away, you could hear it from 5 miles away. So we didn't know much about the V1s until maybe late in 1943, early 1944. We still didn't know what they looked like until they were fired. But this is a shot of Section T's firing range. This is where Molotov and Section T tested the fuse against various aircraft. These are 250-foot towers. They're strung up outside of Albuquerque in New Mexico. And this is a full-sized model of a Japanese fighter plane. And what they were doing was, this is slightly graphic, but they were testing the fragmentation patterns of the shell against the vulnerabilities of the aircraft. So you want the way the shell explodes, you want the shrapnel to hit the plane in the most vulnerable place from the most vulnerable distance. So they were calibrating the sensitivity of the radio waves. So the radio wave would start, you would shoot the shell out of the gun, the radio would bounce off against the aircraft, the radio wave would come back, the shell would recognize that it was bouncing back, and when it hit a certain threshold, ideally usually within 70 feet, that would be the trigger. But we knew that these aircrafts, the V1s, were smaller. So in March of 1944, Section T received plans which were devised based on human intelligence, spies that were able to figure out where the German site was, where they were testing the V1s, because there was another one right near Peenemünde, which we didn't have photographs of. And we got a photograph of a V1 on a launching ramp, and we got a rough idea of its scale. As you can see, the engine's in the wrong place there, but this is what we thought the V1 looked like before we saw it fired. This is the drawing that they used. As you can see, it's the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, again, NACA, precursor to NASA. It doesn't look exactly the same. We have the engine in the wrong place, and it's the wrong kind of engine. But for the purposes of the fuse, it was right enough. We got the wingspan correct. We thought it was 20 feet. It was roughly 20 feet, or 19, 18. This was called, they called it the Peenemünde 20, because it derived from Peenemünde. So this is a shot of a V1, a night shot, a night firing of the V1. You can see the thick glowing line moving from left to right. That's the trail of a pulse jet. And you can see these different anti-aircraft guns which are trying to hit it. I find that just a remarkable, remarkable photograph. So it became clear early on that the British tactics for shooting down the V1s were not working. Over 3,000 people died very quickly within a matter of weeks. The problem was the Royal Aircraft, the British Royal Aircraft, the RAF, Royal Air Force, were trying to catch them over the channel, and they weren't fast enough. The V1s were 408 miles an hour. That exceeded the capacity of most Royal Air Force planes. You would have to fly above them and try to come down over them like this. And there were reports of planes breaking up because that exceeded their their maximum capacity. So very quickly, within a number of, well, let's say 6 weeks, Churchill decides to change tactics. He says, let's move the anti-aircraft guns that we have in the center between London and the coast. Let's move them all to the coast. There they'll have clearance to fire the fuse. You could not fire the fuse over land because it was dangerous. Also, we were worried about spies finding a dud and the Germans reverse engineering it. So let's move all the anti-aircraft guns to the coast and we'll use the smart fuse. And by August of 1944, the beginning of August, all of the anti-aircraft guns, and there were American gunners there as well. We had 80 American guns on the coast as well, were equipped with with Section T's fuse that had been specially calibrated and specially tested against the V1. It turned out, the V1 is a smaller target. It's about half the size of a Japanese Zero, smaller wingspan. So it needed to be more sensitive. The fuse needed to be calibrated more sensitively. And it turned out that the ideal distance was 25 feet. That's where you want it to explode. So after the guns were moved to the coast, there was this immediate improvement of how many V1s they were shooting down. So in other words, before the guns were moved to the coast, the British Anti-Aircraft Command were only shooting down 9% of the targets that they engaged. After they moved to the coast, that jumped to 17. And then you begin to see this dramatic improvement after they start using the smart fuse. Week 1, there's the jumps from 17 to 24%. Now, it wasn't only the smart fuse that arrived at that time. There were several other technologies. There was a better radar. There was a better aiming device. And in concert, these three inventions, all products of OSRD, although obviously radar had a big British influence, show dramatic results. So you see week 2, 24 to 46, 46 to 67. By the end of August of 1944, we were at 80%. And by September of 1944, the V1 attack on London was effectively over. General Frederick Pyle said in 1946 it was the fuse which made possible the 100% success rate that Anti-Aircraft Command was obtaining regularly in the early months of last year. It was American scientists who gave us the final answer to the flying bomb. Section T was there on the coast. There was a physicist named Ed Salant, and he was sent over by Admiral Tuve. He was the liaison to the British, and he was taking a jeep, and he was going all along the coast, and he was training batteries in how to use the fuse. He estimated that the fuse was shooting down 1v1 for every 100 shots. So 20,000 to 1 at the beginning of the war, it's now 100 to 1. It's just a remarkable, complete transformation in anti-aircraft fire from the start of the war to the end. And a lot of it has to do with the fuse. General Pyle, who's the British head of Anti-Aircraft Command, which maybe I just said that, he said his best batteries were getting 1 bomb for every 40 rounds. That would be 10 times better than the regular fuses. When the new radar and the aiming devices could get the fuses close enough, they were 50 times better. And some batteries I saw, this is anecdotal, but they said we were getting 1v1 for every single shot fired. There was a British gunner who said, we would shoot and then I would order cease fire before they had hit the target. That's how confident we were that we were going to get it. And that was just completely revolutionary. More was learned about the potentialities of anti-aircraft work in 80 days, Pyle recalled, than had been learned in the previous 30 years. So this is Section T's headquarters in 1942. That was the used car building, which they first hired. This is in Silver Spring, Maryland. They sold Cadillacs. And on the right, you see this expansion. The building in the left-hand photo that would appear in the right on the right-hand side. And they were just constantly constructing, constantly building, constantly expanding. And you can see this is 1942 on the left. I think that's 43 on the right. And here we have 1945. That's what the Applied Physics Laboratory looked like. Their Section T Central Laboratory. This became the 3rd largest group of American scientists during the war, over 1,000 people by the end of the war, after the Manhattan Project and after the radiation laboratory at MIT. The 3rd was Section T, a small group of 4, right? I had found these interesting lists of things that they purchased, you know. So they bought smoking stands, they bought water coolers, they bought beds. So some of them were sleeping there. You hear descriptions of how hard they worked, like 8-hour days did not exist. We were working at a pace that was all we could physically and mentally put out. By 1945, Section T had the Applied Physics Laboratory, their main laboratory, had a softball team. They had a bowling league. They had an employees association. They had a choral club. They were planning a production of Gilbert and Sullivan. They had regular dances. It was a real community, a real vibrant community by the end of the war. And Tuve was sort of the master of this large, gigantic enterprise. They also had a newsletter. It was called, here's some nice photos of the faces of Section T. Merle Tuve is in the center there. These would be physicists and engineers and statisticians and typists and electrical engineers and so forth. And wonderful faces. Well, there's some other faces here. There's on the bottom row, second to the left is Jack Workman. He's the one that ran Section T's firing range in New Mexico. Ed Salant, who I told you about, who went to England, is the 3rd row from the bottom, second to the left, a balding gentleman there. He was also sent, by the way, to Germany after the war to investigate how much progress the Germans had made on the fuse. as part of Operation Alsos. And so he interviewed hundreds of German fuse scientists to try to figure out why they couldn't do it. And his answer was they weren't organized very well. They weren't organized as well as Van Bush and Merle Tuve organized our side. He's a fantastic character. That's Ray Mindlin. On the left-hand side, third to the top, he's the Columbia professor who received a Medal of Merit for his work on the rugged tubes. There's a couple other key faces there. This is just a wonderful thing that I found in the archives of the APL newsletter. The APL newsletter was called Apple Juice because if you look at the acronym APLJHU, it's phonetically apple juice. So this was like they actually had their own drink, which I'm remembering correctly is like a jigger of Southern Comfort and a jigger of apple juice, which they sort of joke in kind of technical language that you can shake it in a fuse canister if you can waterproof the bottom of the fuse canister. This is the kind of thing that would appear in their newsletter. I want to leave you with what, for me at least, was the most moving document that I found. This was the speech that Merle Tuve gave to the Applied Physics Laboratory on May 8th, 1945, at the end of the European War. And he gave it through the PA system after it was announced that Germany had surrendered. This is not a time when words or phrases are helpful. For most of us, the succession of frightful possibilities and events, crisis after crisis, day after desperate day, which has finally brought us to this passing moment of military victory, has left us almost without the ability to rejoice or be glad over anything. The losses we have sustained, not only in killed and wounded, and in material destruction beyond all comprehension, but in human values, in faith, in confidence that civilization has developed social values which transcend the animal in us, have left us somewhat somber and confused. We all have close blood relatives in the battle zones and countless friends there. Some of you have suffered losses which are beyond all words. Others of us have been spared the sharp pain of a casualty notice, but all of us have sacrificed the finest and best things in our lives to meet the brutal challenge of this war. The lesson from Europe, he continued, was that they could not relax. Quote, "Too many manufacturers and farmers and professors and engineers and businessmen are not in a position to know, as we do, that the German war just missed having a very different length and ending, through mistakes of theirs and not through virtues of our own. Just one team like Section T in Germany, starting as we did in 1940, with just 500 workers on pilot lines, would have altered the entire air war over Europe. I am sure you all join me in the conviction that it is best to celebrate this day by being hard at work as a member of this team." He was, yeah, I think I'll leave it there. And I would love to take questions.
Thank you, Jamie. That was great. It always amazes me how science and military become intertwined in war. I mean, you know, that we saw that in World War I with the you know, how things go from literally from horses to militarize. In World War II, the proximity fuse, the atomic bomb, the Norden bomb sight, radar, sonar, just up. How does Tuve go from a budget of $25,000 to getting over 1,000 people to work for him? Does he have, who becomes his sponsor besides FDR? I mean, where does the support come from?
The support came from the Navy initially. The big jump, I believe I'm trying to figure out to remember exactly how many staff they had when Pearl Harbor happened. I want to say it was something like 120. So he got enough support to get from 4 to 120, but that's, you know, like 16 months or something. So after Pearl Harbor, then support is no problem. Then the Navy immediately puts in money. Then later it's the Army, because they use it in the Bulge as an anti-personnel weapon. So Bush went to bat for him. The Navy went to bat for him. Once it was demonstrated by the Navy in 1943 that this thing works, everyone wanted a version of the fuse for their own guns. I think you may be muted.
Yeah. Before I forget, I want to make sure. Was it the Prince of Wales you were thinking of, the ship?
That's the ship. Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
You mentioned about the post-mortem on the shells. What, you know, those 800 shells, what was it that they were looking? Were they trying to dissect anything and everything before they sent this out to production?
Yeah.
And of that, and for me, who's not a scientist, of those 500 parts and 300 have to work really well and they're really important. And you still said if you got them all working well, it still could be you're still at 5%. Walk me through that? You know, like how do you get it from 5% to 50% to 90% to success? You know, so
yeah. That's was sort of a simplified expression of the problem, but the fact was you had to get most parts to work 100% of the time. Like that was the thing. They narrowed it down to, I think they had the tubes working at 98% something, and that was enough. And then there was a whole different story with the batteries, a few other parts. But there were, for most of the parts, getting to 100 was relatively easy. And then there was like 10 parts, which was more difficult. And it took them, you know, a couple of years to get everything up to 100 or near it.
Remember, if you got a question, use the chat feature. I'm sure there's people out there who want to know how we can become members of the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, just because it'd be, try to beat that at a party. What does Tuve do after the war?
Tuve becomes president of the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism. He goes back to his research. He does research, if I recall, in geological, he did geological research. I know he did research on geological tremors. He sort of puts the fuse project in his rearview mirror. And he liked to say that he had 3 lives. One was his work as an experimental physicist, one was as the head of Section T, and the other was his post-war work. He didn't like to think about, from what I could tell, the fuse that much. There was a part of him that regretted making a weapon that was used against German troops in the Battle of the Bulge. He was not, one of the things that drew me to the story is that these were men and women of science. These are not people interested in making weapons. It's not why you become a scientist, because you're interested in hurting people. So Tuve was he's very fiery. He was also humane and sensitive to the damage of war and the darkness of war. So he goes back to his life as a scientist. There's Lucy. Maybe Lucy should chime in. She could probably tell us.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Dad actually worked on multiple different ideas, research projects. He worked on the Earth's crust, a study of the Earth's crust, working again with the Navy, who did explosives in the ocean for him. I traveled with them on many seismology trips. He did radio astronomy in spades for many, many, many years. He encouraged the biophysics group that was actually housed in the cyclotron building where I worked one summer, actually. So he ran weekly seminars at lunchtime for the lab people, so that any and all research topics were of interest. He was profoundly interested in research.
Yeah.
So he covered many different fields.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. And thanks for joining us tonight too.
It's my pleasure.
Jamie, is there a question here? Is there modern use of this technology in place today?
Yes, there are proximity fuses today. I think the Israeli Iron Dome uses proximity fuses. I mean, the electronics, of course, are not the same at all. But yeah, they still have proximity fuses for sure.
And did the Germans, the Japanese, ever get an equivalent of this?
Not of the shell fuse. So I made the distinction between the difficulty of the engineering challenge in the shell fuse because of the pressure and the relative ease of making a fuse in bombs and in rockets. The Japanese did make a fuse for bombs. I think it actually saw combat battle. They actually used it. The Germans did devise fuses for probably bombs and maybe rockets. They didn't use them, and they were not able to even get a shell fuse into production. So they were not able to solve the challenge that Section T did. And if you look at these reports that Ed Salant made of his interviews with these German scientists, they basically did not think that they could make the vacuum tube strong enough to withstand the pressures in the gun. So they tried to make a workaround. So the American model had 4, sometimes 5 tubes. They tried to work around where they said, okay, maybe if we can just have 1 tube and we'll make it like a radio sensitive tube. They tried that, it didn't work. So they were very fragmented, unlike on the American side where this was all concentrated at Section T. They had over 50 different projects, the Germans did, at the beginning of the war. So a lot of different projects, a lot of redundancy, not very good coordination, not very good harnessing of basic scientists, recruitment of basic scientists, not very good coordination between the scientists and the military and the scientists and the government. So all of the things, as I think I mentioned, all of the things that Tuve and Bush did very well, Germany did poorly.
What did Section T ultimately evolve to? I mean, essentially, where is it today?
You know, the latest that I found a document where they referenced the term Section T is 1948. And it was on a journal, and they still called it the Section T Applied Physics Laboratory. When I published this book, I don't want to talk out of turn, but the Applied Physics Laboratory was like, why are you calling us Section T? They didn't even really know that actually APL was just the main lab of Section T, because the way some other historians have written it, it was just the foundation of APL, and that was it. So they didn't really understand that it was Section T and then APL. So it just lost its name. APL became the main name. It became the name of the lab, and they kept on with pretty much the same research. They do a very similar research now than what Section T did. And Section T had other projects at the end of the war. Once the fuse was fairly well developed, they took on other projects near the end of the war, aiming devices, other projects for the Navy.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. This has been a great pleasure. The name of the book is 12 Seconds to Silence. His name is Jamie Holmes. Thank you for doing this. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Stay safe out there. Try not to drive in this weather. And again, the book is available at 8 Cousins. Thank you, everybody. And we'll see you next time. Stay safe.
Thank you, Mark.